Hello, and welcome to the World History Addicts podcast, a show where we discuss history and global politics through a social and anthropological lens. My name is Devon, and today I will be talking with my co-host Nick about the modern world, when it began, and what makes it modern and different from pre-modernity. Let's begin.
Devon, it's been a while.
Yeah, man, it's been a really long time.
It's been like almost 2 months since we recorded an episode. I don't think the listeners are gonna really feel that lull because everything's just gonna be they're gonna be getting bulldozed with podcasts. But for you and I, the past 2 months have been kind of busy. What's been going on?
Yeah, well, for one, I just got back from having COVID.
Oh man,
Yeah,
summer COVID.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, before that, I was at summer camp. So I was at the summer camp, and then on the bus ride back, I got COVID. And before that, believe it or not, I actually lived in a house with two people who also had COVID.
Man.
And I managed to dodge COVID for 11 days straight while living with them. And then I went to the summer camp, and I was fine. Then on the way back, I got COVID.
Dude, why don't you enlighten the listeners on what summer camp was?
Yeah, so summer camp at ICANN is really an experience. And I mean, I'm 27 now, and I've never been to a summer camp before, and I honestly thought that my chance to go to one was pretty much gone by the time I became an adult. But I was wrong, and I went to summer camp, and it was amazing.
Dude, what'd you do at summer camp?
Oh, we did all types of things. We went swimming several days. We went down the slip and slide, which was really fun.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, we also did paintballing and shot a bunch of the coaches with the paintball gun.
Did you get shot with the paintball?
Well, they weren't allowed to shoot at us.
Wait, so it was one-sided. So basically, you guys just
one-sided.
it was all you guys just shooting at coaches.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's crazy.
We actually did lots of shooting sports because there was also BB guns, and I got to show off my skills with a rifle.
Very cool.
And before that, we were also doing archery, and I was one of the I think I was the only client to get a bullseye.
Really, you got a bullseye?
Yeah, I actually got two bullseyes. One of them was kind of on the border between like a bullseye and then just like the ring right outside the bullseye. But then like a few shots after that, I got a full center of the target bullseye.
That's amazing, man.
Yeah, they got me ice cream too for that.
By the way, for people who may not know, what is ICANN? What is ICANN?
Well, ICANN is it's an organization that helps I think mostly adults with disabilities.
Yeah.
There are lots of different types of disabilities here. Some of us are like myself have some kind of Asperger's syndrome. Other people I think have more speech impediments. There are lots of people with learning disabilities, but ICANN's here for all of us.
Dude, awesome. And that was a rhetorical question because I work for ICANN too.
Yeah.
So very cool. All right, man. Well, yeah, I mean, you went to summer camp, then you got sick, so we couldn't really do much. But here we are. We're back in the saddle, ready to hunker down and get some more episodes recorded.
Yeah.
That being said, today we're going to be talking through episode 6, titled "When Did the Modern World Begin?" Right? And Devin, since you're the historian here, first of all, what do you mean by the modern world, right? And then when would you say it began?
Yeah, that's actually the big question that I think many people struggle with, because when you say what's modernity, I think people say, well, now was modern, of course, the 2000s are modern. But then, of course, it's like, well, the 1990s were modern, the 1980s were definitely modern.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a question of, like, how far back you can push modernity. Like, were the 1920s modern? Was World War I modern? Was the Wild West a part of modern history?
Yeah, totally.
So defining modernity is actually really difficult because there are lots of developments over time that you could argue were modern. And the way that mainstream historians actually frame it is that we live in the late modern period. The late modern period started sometime in the mid 1700s.
Okay.
Around the time that I think around the same time as like the American Revolution, and before that there's the early modern period, which stretches from about the voyages of Columbus in the 1490s or the conquistador expeditions in the 1500s. Basically the age of exploration, when there are all these European sailors traveling around the world to places that most of Europe didn't even know existed.
So a lot of the general consensus then is that it begins around the quote-unquote discovery of the New World.
Yeah, the early modern period is basically the 1500s to the, I think, like mid to late 1700s.
Totally.
Which,
totally.
And admittedly, it is a very different kind of time. I think you can separate it from the medieval era that came before it, because, well, for one, there were people traveling to areas that medieval Europeans really had never been to. It was also a time of major ideological change, because it's also when the Protestant Reformation went down and pretty much flipped the status quo in Europe on its head.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was also when guns started becoming much more important, because before that, there were definitely gunpowder weapons like cannons and smaller hand cannons that were like early muskets. But by the 1600s, you have like full-blown muskets and armies that are centered around using gunpowder.
Okay. So, all right. Well, I guess that everything you just told me is going to be what modern historians would kind of give you the gist of, but do you agree with them, right?
Well, the thing is that I don't actually entirely agree with it, because if you start looking more into how modernity gets defined and how they actually, when they say modernity began, it doesn't quite add up.
Okay.
And I'll go over that right now. So let's see. So historians basically categorize the ancient and classical era from the Bronze Age, that's like 2200 BC, to the end of the Roman Empire, which I think checks out. You can see a continuity from like the Greeks and like the Greco-Roman world and like the decline of Rome. And then the medieval era stretches from the fall of Rome in around 500 AD. That's like the official end of the Western Roman Empire, all the way into the late 1400s, around the end of Constantinople.
Yeah.
With that falls in 1453. And by the time Columbus sets sail and lands in Cuba, that's also considered the end of the definitive end of the medieval world.
Wow.
And then they argue that the early modern period starts from Columbus into the late 1700s, so basically from Columbus to Washington. And that's where I think it starts to run into issues, because if you think about it, even though the Columbus and his crew were going where no European had gone before, it still very much was kind of a medieval world.
Yeah,
because
that's kind of what makes me want to ask, like, what makes you disagree slightly with, or not? If maybe it's a big disagreement. I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, the world Columbus lived in was still one where much of the world hadn't been charted yet. So even though he had gone to the Caribbean, and that was a completely unknown area to everyone in Europe, there was still much of the world that hadn't been explored yet. Like he had no idea that he had even found a new continent in the first place. He was actually under the impression that he had landed somewhere in Southeast Asia, because that was actually the original aim of his mission. Sail to the west, find a better, easier route to China, and trade with spices to get rich. That was actually the whole point of the expedition. And because of that, when he saw the tropical islands, he was under the impression he was in the Philippines or in somewhere else in like Indonesia. Not that he found an entirely new continent with people who had no idea what a European was.
That wouldn't be the reason why. This is totally kind of off topic, but that wouldn't be the reason why like people refer to Native Americans as Indians.
It is actually.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, because back in like the late 1400s, the term for Asia was just India, because that was kind of the only part of Asia they knew all that much about.
Okay.
Like they had basically no idea about like what Korea was, or like what Japan was. That was still a very unknown part of the world to many Europeans.
So he's referring to them as Indians, thinking that they're in India, and then they just kind of got it became synonymous with the word, or the Native Americans became synonymous with Indians.
Exactly.
Okay, I see.
Because, I mean, it wasn't until the more explorers started traveling, because some of those explorers, I believe, had also been to Southeast Asia, so they knew it wasn't the same place, because it was different enough they could tell.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So, let's see here.
Yeah. Also, Columbus still lived in a world where the battlefield was still run heavily by melee weapons, like pikes. Those are like long spears that you can use to like stop horse riders from like charging into your position. Yeah. They also used swords much more heavily, because guns at this time were still very primitive, and you couldn't rely on them to win battles. And that's actually one misconception that I think many people have of like the conquest of the Aztec Empire. Totally. It actually wasn't done by guns, because there's only so much damage you can do with a group of musketeers, like maybe a few hundred men against like thousands of Aztec warriors. Yeah. It was really the horses, I think, that made the big difference, because if you have a few of those, you can just bulldoze through an enemy that doesn't have them.
So it was the Europeans that had horses and not the Aztecs. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Or the Native Americans, I
horses
guess?
were basically non-existent throughout all the Americas. So in the North America, they didn't have them. The Caribbean, they definitely didn't have them.
Oh, that's right.
South
huh?
America, yeah, no horses there either.
So so then I've heard that you just memory unlocked. Like you would think that because of like cowboy imagery, how synonymous it is with America, like horses are just indigenous. Quote, I don't not indigenous, but they're animals. Is that correct word?
The thing actually is that horses are actually from America. It's just that they developed in America, traveled north up through Alaska into Siberia, and then spread throughout Eurasia. But then they went extinct in the Americas. So in a weird way, it was kind of like they were returning home when they were finally brought to the Americas by the Spaniards.
They just came back with Europeans.
Yeah,
on
exactly.
boats.
Yeah.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
The story of horses is a really strange one, honestly.
See, it's those little details that kind of like fascinate me. Okay, so you're talking about like gunpowder. You're talking about use of horses. I guess that leads me to the next question right here. What like you kind of touched on it already, but are there any other elements that made the world modern at that point?
Well, at that time, there were definitely many developments. Like I mentioned earlier, the Protestant Reformation was going on.
Yeah.
And this eventually led into the 30 Years' War, which was kind of like a great European war between the Catholic powers and the Protestant powers that eventually spiraled off into a much larger and bloodier conflict.
Yeah.
And the end of that was the nation-state model that came out of the conflict, because they realized that at the end of the day, the church actually wasn't all that powerful, and it was just local rulers who actually mattered.
And we kind of like touched on these eras too in the Italian trilogy, like when this is all kind of this is reminding me of when we talked about the beginning of the early to modern era in Italian history, but even bigger than that, what we're talking about today is worldwide history, just kind of the grander scheme of things.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Right? Okay.
And what else? There's also I think this is getting into the 16 and early 1700s. You get mercantilism, which is the economic theory that all the European colonial empires subscribe to, that you should maximize your own trade and try to give as little gold as possible to all the other empires and take and hoard as much of it as possible, which is, I mean, definitely what the Spanish did with their the gold mines. They ran all these gigantic mines in the New World using forced labor from the native people to get filthy rich.
So, do you think that this is some of the roots of like capitalism being instilled?
Yes, because mercantilism eventually turned into the modern form of free market capitalism that we have today.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's kind of like a proto version of what we have today. Mm-hmm. And there's also flintlock muskets and drill formations. Like, you know, every guy stands in a line, and then when they give the order, they aim and shoot all at the same time, just maximize the rate of fire.
Gotcha.
It looks kind of archaic today because, like why would you be standing out in the open with all these bright uniforms to just get shot at? But the reason is because if it's organized, you can shoot and aim and reload faster, and that eventually causes the other side to break apart and run. So
it's more effective to have everyone shoot at once.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, the scientific method shows up in the late 1600s and early 1700s. That's around when Sir Isaac Newton is around. And he starts making all these breakthroughs in how you can carry out experiments and control different variables.
Yeah.
And then collect data and then use the data to make predictions on how the world, on what will happen or how the world works.
Cool.
Which up until that point was really not something people did, because people weren't stupid. They knew how to do trial and error, but it wasn't a very methodical process in the way that the later scientists did.
Okay.
So some, I think, have argued that this is when modernity begins because science defines modernity. And I think they kind of have a point because, I mean, if you're going back to like the Middle Ages and the explanation for just about everything is that it's just kind of the will of God, or it's just part of a natural order that can't really be questioned or entirely understood.
Yeah.
That was just the status quo way of everyone seeing everything. But then after the 1700s, well, then it's more that you can figure out why things are the way they are by analyzing it and by collecting data.
Okay, so do you think that's one of the core factors in bringing?
I think it does, because it leads into the real reason for modernity.
Okay.
So now we're in the 1700s, and the West looks very strange because, as I was mentioning, all the men wear these really bright colors that they didn't for the next I think 200 years. It's only like into the 1960s and 70s when they started making a comeback.
Wow. Okay, yeah, and I see you have a note here because aesthetically, the 1700s in the West were especially strange because it was before men stopped wearing bright colors, wigs, and high heels. Dude,
Yeah.
that's awesome. But also, I wonder why they stopped wearing all that stuff.
They stopped wearing that around the end, I think, of the 1700s. So into the 1800s, they started moving away from like the wigs and more towards like top hats and suits and ties and that type of look. And that look has actually remained dominant ever since then.
Yeah.
I think up until around like maybe 50 years ago when the countercultural movement started pushing back against that.
Okay.
Yeah. So the 1700s don't really look modern, but that's not actually the entire reason that they're not fully modern. And I'll finally explain why it is. And I think the reason is it's industrialization.
Okay.
Industry and the adoption of industry and running your entire society around factories and production is what makes a society truly modern.
Absolutely.
And I think that's probably the main reason that history changes so much in this time from like the late 1700s up to the 19th century.
So that's actually a really good point that I'm sure you have a lot of insight on. Like, we're not educated, at least I wasn't educated in the public school system, to understand like the relationship between the overall well-being of human society, the relationship between their well-being and production, and how they make things, how much they can produce, what they do with what they produce, what they do with the profits that they produce. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a direct relation that I know you're going to get to, that Karl Marx calls out later on.
Yeah, exactly.
But do you have anything to say about that? Right, the relationship between how well society lives and what it's able to produce.
Yeah. So the Industrial Revolution has actually been called one of the most important events in human history because the amount of wealth that a few people were able to produce with basically a very similar amount of labor and effort, because of course, working in the fields was also very hard work, but they weren't able to produce any not even close to as much as they were able to produce inside factories. Like even primitive factories were vastly more productive than just working in the fields and like craftsmen's guilds and ad hoc building.
Totally.
Yeah, so just because of that, the amount of wealth just skyrockets once industrialization takes hold, and originally in Britain, and then the rest of Europe, and then in America, and I think from there, it's the next big country to industrialize was actually Japan. Weirdly enough, I think there's some limited industrialization going on in Latin America, and today it's mostly like Asia, like China, Southeast Asia, India, and I think of some Middle Eastern countries like Iran and Turkey that are also adopting industry.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but once any society adopts industry as like the main core of what they're about, it rewrites everything, and it's not just the material benefits because of people getting richer and being able to have more with less work. It revolutionizes the military because suddenly instead of having a bunch of craftsmen build muskets or worse yet like swords or bows for your army, you can just have a factory mass produce them, and they're all standardized too. So you can just replace different parts on the gun if it breaks. There's also infrastructure that gets transformed because suddenly you have like canal locks, railroads, telegraph lines, steamboats. And eventually they get into planes and airports, which really wouldn't be possible without industry. Many people have tried to make flying machines, like I believe Leonardo da Vinci tried to create a flying machine all the way back in like medieval Europe or Renaissance Europe. And he was a brilliant guy, but even then he wasn't able to do it because they didn't have the same type of mechanical power sources. They didn't have like coal power or engines back in the 1400s. So no matter how efficient he was able to make the system, like muscle power alone wouldn't be able to do it. Yeah. Now, the interesting part about what industry does is that it rewrites how societies behave and really how a society thinks. Because once they adopt industry, religion actually starts declining. And I think the reason for this is, first off, the standard of living increases dramatically, and that changes how people see the world. But also, I think it's because once you have a factory and you start building everything around accommodating the factory, and everything becomes standardized. Like you have to be at the factory right at this moment, like at noon.
Yeah.
And everything that's made there is is optimized to be as efficient as possible. Well, it
yeah.
starts to eliminate a lot of the need for like a higher power because we are the ones taking control of production now, and it's I think there's just a lot less that's left to chance. Because in societies that are where their survival depends on chance, belief in a higher power is pretty much mandatory.
Wow. So it almost negates the quote unquote need for a god, which is obviously not objectively true, but like, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, like, it seems that people.
I mean, it certainly affects the psychology, I think, to the point that the
Yeah.
need for like a guardian angel just kind of disappears once you have all these certainties that are put into like the industrial system.
Or like praying for crops or like water or whatever. Like, why do that when we can
if
just
you can just
regiment
mass
it.
produce
Exactly.
fertilizer, which
Exactly.
basically guarantees that the crops will grow.
So this is just a monument. So this, yeah, you're right. The industrialization of society, not only it changes everything. It changes everything. Okay. Let's see here real quick. You talk about standardization.
Yeah.
Were there
also,
critics of? Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So also another interesting point that I don't think gets brought up very much is that feminism and expansion of women's rights actually come out of industrialization because once industry becomes mainstream and widespread, it suddenly becomes much more sensible for female workers to take a major role in the workforce because. It's like even if they're weaker on average than the most men, they can still sew and they can still operate the machinery because it actually negates a lot of the advantage that stronger people have because the machine does all the heavy lifting for you.
Okay.
And
Interesting. Okay.
what else? There's also so standardization and efficiency rewrites how society sees everything because suddenly it's not the will of God. It's just a question of like how well you're optimizing the factory and the production system. And really, it's a civilizational shift, really on the same level as the transition from being a hunter or a gatherer or a nomadic pastoralist to farming, because it's entirely different mode of production. Mm-hmm. It's entirely different lifestyle and just a worldview that goes along with it.
Yeah, again, like, I'm going to ask you, we'll get to the critics of all, because there has to be a downside to all this, right? In everything. But I believe Karl Marx does talk about how, again, like you just said, once people learn how to farm and do agriculture, the quality of life increased and they were able to settle and people were able, and that changed society. So as our modes of production change, society almost leaps forward, right? Or is able to make progress in a way that it hadn't before.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, that's just really fascinating to me because we don't really think about it that way.
Yeah, I think one of the most infamous critics of industrialization is actually the Unabomber, a man named Ted Kaczynski.
Okay.
And he actually wrote
I've heard of this guy, by the way.
very famous quote that's getting lots of traction online that says, "The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster." I think it goes for humanity or just for everyone. But
This guy, sorry to interrupt. This guy wasn't related to the Luddites, was he?
I mean, he's kind of like a modern Luddite if you think about it, because his main criticism of the modern world is that people aren't really supposed to have all these conveniences, and that it actually begins encroaching on human freedom because all of this technology and the factories and the industrial production systems all have to be managed by managerial systems. And they eventually start controlling every single aspect of your life, like where you need to be at all times, what you can say, what you can do. And it doesn't leave much room for the human spirit, and he really took issue with that. I think he actually ended up retreating to this secluded like cabin in the middle of nowhere because he just wanted to get away from civilization.
Funny, it almost rings. I know about people who want to do that. And I mean, you have people doing that, opting out and going and living in vans and just going camping everywhere.
Getting off the grid.
So it's interesting that, okay, well, first of all, why was he infamous? What did he do anything bad or something?
He's the Unabomber. He mailed bombs to several universities and I think to several like high-tech fields. So he actually killed several people.
That's
and
bad.
I think he was only caught because his brother was, I think, working with part of the investigation, and he recognized his handwriting in one of the letters that he sent, and they were able to trace it back to him that way. Wow. Yeah, but it's really interesting because the Unabomber was actually a highly intelligent guy, but it's just his worldview was alien to most people around today.
Well, it almost points to how while yes we do have all of these grand machines and factories that can mass produce anything ever, it almost seems like one of the consequences is like you said, like every aspect of people's lives becomes controlled. People are working 16 hours a day in factories. People don't have weekends, right? Obviously, we're not going to talk about this in this episode, but that's probably a topic for later, like the labor struggles of the early 1900s and late 1800s.
Yeah,
right. To where enough was enough, and people had to get together and form unions to barter for better conditions, right?
Demand things like I think it was like the 5-day work week. Like before, I believe it was actually a 6-day work week, and you had to work on every day except for Sunday.
There you go. And so all I'm saying is like with this humongous upswing of production, there's also this humongous increase in human suffering for certain types of people, not everybody.
Physical and like in the factories, but also psychological, because I think the Unabomber also touches on this. Because at the end of the day, people are still like psychologically tribal Stone Age people. I mean,
that's what I was
psychology
getting at.
Hasn't really changed that much since the days of the caveman.
In these conditions, you get people who become Unabombers, essentially. Like, I feel like he wasn't born ready to just go bomb people. Maybe he had some bad trauma or something going on and made him, I don't know, mentally ill or whatever.
I researched about him, he was actually experimented on by the U.S. Military and government in the infamous MK Ultra experiments.
Wait, when was this?
That was the 1960s, I think.
Dude, for some reason I thought this guy was like in the 1800s or 1700s.
Oh, no. He's a 20th century figure.
Oh, my goodness. All right. So, any other critics?
The other big one was actually Karl Marx. It wasn't. He wasn't just criticizing industrialization. He was actually criticizing the capitalism that came along with it.
Okay.
He was a major analyst on how it transformed people's lives, how industrialization transformed pretty much everyone's lives in the areas where it was taking place.
Yeah.
And also, Karl Marx is actually another key in how I got to the conclusion that industrialization is modernity.
Okay.
Because through his analysis of everything, he came up with several books like Das Kapital and eventually the Communist Manifesto. Mm-hmm. And that's from like the 1840s to the 1860s. And his, as I put it, his formulation of dialectics and material analysis are very modern ways of thinking that just wouldn't have existed in, say, the medieval world or even in the early modern world.
Right.
Like if you had tried to explain to Columbus or Cortez about like the material conditions, I think they would just look at you like you're crazy because these ideas didn't exist back then.
Yeah, it's almost as if I've heard people say like this way of thinking, Marxist thinking, is like the inevitable shadow of industrialization or capitalism, right? Like capitalism's shadow is communism, essentially. Like it exists because this exists. And you're right. If this would have been brought up 200 years prior, they'd be like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, I mean, even with like George Washington, if you're trying to explain like the communist theory to him, I mean, even as like as a landowner or someone who probably would have had stood a lot to lose from the communist ideas, he wouldn't have been able to connect with much of it because America at that time was still a agrarian pre-industrial society, and that's also why I was making the argument that the American Revolution was actually a pre-industrial war.
Wow, okay.
Or a pre-modern war, really.
See, now all your earlier points are starting to make sense if when we think about it in the
lens of like how much does industry affect their the society.
Yeah, because earlier in the episode, let me look at the notes, but you were talking about Columbus, you're talking about all these little European guys running around colonizing, and historians will say that that's where the modern era began. But again, you're making a really good point that says maybe, but it makes more sense that the modern era would begin when the Industrial Revolution occurred.
Exactly.
Anyways, that's just a higher level note. So, question. Let me see here real quick. How does this narrow down the window for the beginnings of the modern world? So, I guess, like, what did you mean by that? Sorry.
Yeah, because I wanted to narrow down the time frame for when modernity began to as pretty much as little time as possible. Like,
gotcha.
Not just I didn't want to just broaden it to like say a century. I wanted to shorten it to like maybe a few decades.
Okay.
So, in the Industrial Revolution began in Britain around the 1750s, 1760s, around that time frame, and it continued on until the 1800s, where more and more of Britain became industrialized. They were the pioneers in the Industrial Revolution, after all, the first industrial empire. So I don't think it actually began in the 1750s, 60s, or even 70s, because the American Revolution was in the 1770s, from 1776 to 1783,
okay.
And I don't think that's really counts as a modern war. It was still very much war fought by agricultural societies against each other.
Yeah.
So I really think it's around 1840 to 1860, the middle of the 19th century, where industry finally reaches a critical mass and starts affecting the whole world. Because the British by this point are the undisputed masters of the sea.
Yeah.
They've got colonies everywhere. They're the empire in which the sun never sets.
Land versus sea.
Yep, exactly.
Episode 5. You better listen to that, people.
Yeah, so I think that's actually when the modern world begins, from the 1840s, where there were all these revolutions in Europe, like the revolutions of 1848, and all the way into the 1860s, where we see the Civil War, which many historians actually consider to be the first truly modern war.
Dude,
Yeah.
Great point. So, just to summarize, just to drive the point home, make sure everyone's tracking along. If you had a devil's advocate type person trying to challenge your idea for this, right? And they're trying to give me like 3 solid pieces of evidence, or I don't know what the standard is. Give me some like solid evidence, right, as to why the modern world begins in the 1840s, or let's say, what would you tell?
About the 1840s to 60s, maybe even the 1870s. So there are lots of major developments going on that I think look very modern. So the first big one is the First and the Second Opium Wars, where the British and France defeated the Chinese military using industrial militaries. Basically, they used steamboats, they used rifles, they used modern artillery, and they used all types of technology that China just didn't have access to. And despite the insane difference between the sides of the different armies fighting each other, the British and the French won out. And this was unheard of because China actually has been conquered many times in the past by barbarians and nomads from the north, like the Manchus, and before that the Mongols. But a European power from northern Europe just coming over and defeating the full force of the Chinese military was unheard of.
Okay.
And that really changed the balance of power in the Far East.
What year was this? Sorry. What years were this?
1839 to 1842, I think.
There you go, 1840s. Your point.
Yeah, so the 1840. And also there's the Communist Manifesto published in 1848, which is also the same year that there's this wave of nationalist uprisings across all of Europe.
Okay.
I think it's kind of like comparable to their version of the Arab Spring in a way.
Okay.
Because many of the revolutions were crushed, but they still left their mark on how these nations would develop.
Got you. Okay, 1848.
Yeah,
Communist
there's also
Manifesto.
the Crimean War in 1853, which is also considered by some historians to be the first modern war, because it relied on railroads and also steamships, which the British had. And also, it's interesting because it marks the point where the Ottoman Empire had gotten so weak that it needed to be propped up by the British and the French, because it was really a war to stop the Russians from conquering the Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Turkey.
Okay.
And coincidentally, in 1853, the U.S. Navy went on an expedition to Japan to open up the country after over 200 years of isolation. After Japan unified in the early 1600s, they banned foreigners from entering outside of... the Dutch actually had this small concession area in southern Japan where they could trade. And I think that was like the source of all of Japan's knowledge of the outside world for several centuries. But yeah, they banished pretty much all of the foreigners, and they actually also stopped Japanese people outside of Japan who had moved somewhere else from moving back. And of course, Japanese citizens were actually banned from leaving the country.
You know what? That's an interesting note. How long did you say Japan was closed off to the rest of the world?
Roughly, I think about 2.5 centuries.
So look at that's in our human lifetimes. That's a massive amount of time, right?
Yeah, it is.
But I think about like there's countries now that are closed off, like North Korea, right? Or who else?
I guess Afghanistan's pretty closed off.
Yeah,
now.
like and a lot of it's highly political. But I guess what I'm trying to say is like, in the grander scheme of things, that's likely not going to be permanent. They're likely going to open up someday, right? And all my life, I've known that I mainly bring up like DPRK North Korea because like that's just the cliche one that people talk about. I think that's not the best thing, but that's just the one that comes to mind. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that in the grander scheme of things, people in about 100 years it's not really going to affect them because it will already have been opened up, hopefully. Whereas looking at this 200-year example in Japan, like, you know, I didn't know that. We didn't know that living here in 2024, you know, and the world moved on. That's what I'm trying to say. History moved past all that. And
yeah, I mean, North Korea probably won't still be closed in 150 years.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Tokugawa, Japan, which is the Japan under the isolation, is a very different kind of case.
Totally. And that's just a little side, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Also, outside of the wars and the ideology, there was also major technological breakthroughs. Like there were gigantic railroads being constructed across the U.S. I think it was in 1869.
Yeah.
They finally linked up the country using railroads, which was a huge achievement.
Which is, by the way, thinking about, you've driven from Florida to California, right?
I took a plane there, but I think we actually drove from Washington to Oregon. That was a while ago, and that was a long car ride.
So in my past, I've played music, and I would tour across the country all the time.
Yeah.
That is a massive feat for people in the 60s, 50s. When were they building railroads?
I think the railroads were being built around, I think, like the 1860s.
Dude,
so.
For people across the entire, like you're talking about the East Coast, all that terrain. Then you're talking about like the Appalachian Mountains,
Appalachians and the Midwest,
the Great Plains,
Yep.
then the deserts in the West,
and then all the way to the Pacific Coast,
and all the mountains that block off the Pacific Coast. Like, dude, that's amazing. I think that's amazing. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's crazy. Also, telegraph lines were also being built everywhere to interconnect everything with communication.
Awesome.
And also, there's the mass adoption of cartridge firearms, because before then, if you wanted to shoot a gun, you had to load the powder manually and then load the wadding and the bullet, and then you got one shot. And if you had a revolver, you had maybe 6 shots, but you had to load them all into the gun manually. But once you got the cartridge firearms, that's like a brass case that has the bullet and the powder inside already. You can just push into the gun, and then you can just shoot, and then you can easily just reload it. You don't have to basically build a bullet inside the gun every time. And it's also the reason why rapid-fire guns like the Gatling gun and like actual machine guns in the 1880s, I think the first was the Maxim gun, are finally possible. And that also revolutionizes warfare.
Yeah.
There's I already mentioned the U.S. Civil War. Another
Photography
interesting
in there?
one is photography, because it had already been around in the 1820s. I think that's when the first photographs showed up. But it's not really until the 1840s and 50s that, for example, you actually have U.S. presidents who had their pictures taken. We can actually see what they looked like through the lens of a camera.
Yeah, wow.
Because before that, you kind of had to trust that artist was being honest, and that they were or that they were just good at actually drawing what someone looked like.
He wasn't going to draw you with a huge head.
Yeah, but after that, well, the camera doesn't lie. They didn't have Photoshop in 1860, so
there we go.
You could trust that the people actually looked like the way that they were depicted.
Okay.
And it's also in this same era that we get lots of nationalist and unification movements. Like there's the unification of Italy under the Risorgimento, which I went over in the Italian history trilogy.
Yeah.
There's also the unification of Germany, too, which happened at basically the same time in the early 1870s. And we also got the beginning of Slavic independence movements in the Balkans, like Bulgaria and Serbia. And it's also when the Japanese Empire begins expanding.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Also, it's in the same era that the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche started commenting on the decline of religion, which was caused largely by industry. And this was in the mid 1800s, so he definitely knew the path that it was taking, even all the way back then.
Wow. So all of these points are to drive home your analysis.
Exactly.
That this all begins in the 1840s and not prior.
Exactly. Yeah.
Dude, okay. So then on that note, just higher level, zooming out, what can we take away from all this, right? That's kind of our end of show question. What does it all mean, Devin? And what conclusions can we come to?
Yeah. So the first point is history isn't always predictable, and it can often exceed the bounds of what everyone expects.
Okay.
Our future could be shaped by some type of technology that we don't even know exists yet. Like nuclear fission, I think was actually in the news a few years ago. They finally found a way to do nuclear fission, but as far as I know, they haven't done anything major with it yet.
Wow.
Or there might be something even bigger, like someone might actually find a way to travel through time or teleport across dimensions.
And I think we're probably living through one right now with artificial intelligence.
Exactly. Yeah, that's actually the next big technological revolution, I
Wow.
would say.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, imagine it from the perspective like someone living in like the era of like the American Revolution. Like the idea that their entire world would get turned upside down by factories would be pretty insane to them. But that's still what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's wild on that note too is, what am I trying to say? I think with like if you were to try to explain to someone, what am I trying to say? Like in the 50s or whatever, that someday you will be able to hold a piece of glass in your hand and see one of your loved ones across the world and talk to them wirelessly with no connections. That's unfathomable at that time, right? I think there are things that we will see in our lifetimes, hopefully, if we get to grow old, that we can't even fathom yet, right?
Yeah, it's things that we don't even know are possible yet. Things
Exactly.
that are just so far outside of our, of like the scientific Overton window, so to speak, that it's just kind of it'll come out of the blue for many people.
Totally. Anyways, that's a little side note. Okay. What other takeaways, Devin?
Well, the other big takeaway is that with the good often comes the bad, because the good is that they ended the feudal system and they led to to a huge increase in the standards of living and possibilities of what people could do materially. But it also led to the beginning of the early forms of capitalism, like the sweatshops and the factories, and like basically all the bad stereotypes of like what industrialization brings. Mm-hmm. And it was bad both materially for the people, and it was also very bad psychologically. And I think it's the psychological effects have actually only gotten worse over time.
Some would say we are now in the decline of capitalism, and there's a new shift taking place.
I mean, after the Industrial Revolution, then there was the Digital Revolution, and there's plenty of potential that came out of it. And it's, I mean, I like surfing on the internet myself, and it certainly has some very detrimental effects to people's psychology. Like attention spans are really going down.
Yeah,
people are basically addicted to the internet now, and that's definitely not good. And socialization is going down because people just would rather message each other or talk on the internet than
it's very isolating.
face-to-face,
it almost seems that
which is not good for your mental health at all.
We've become very isolated from each other too as people. Okay.
Yeah, and going along with that, industrial modernity saw an increase in colonial atrocities, especially in formerly unreachable places, because in the 1500s and 1600s, the Age of Sail allowed the Europeans to move to many new continents that up until then they didn't know existed. But even then, there were still places that they had trouble getting to, like, say, Central Asia or parts of the interior of Africa. Mm-hmm. But once they started getting steamboats and more technology, like in medicine, that allowed them to get through malaria and come out alive, it was possible for them to colonize even more parts of the world and kill even more people around the world too.
I don't think it's controversial to say that there is a direct correlation between like colonialism and the economic system of the time.
Yes, of course. The empires ran on that system.
Again, just saying that because those are things that like I wasn't taught growing up, right? In like public school, right? You're taught that these are just isolated things that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they are taught it now. I don't remember being taught this. But these are just isolated events that are unrelated, and history is not in any way connected to economics and blah, blah, blah. But it's all connected, baby. It's a big web.
Yeah. I think my issue with history and how it was taught in the schools was that it seems very disconnected from each other. There are lots of different kind of stories and like time periods, but not really a question of why they reflect on each other, why they're all related to each other.
And part of the reason why I like doing this podcast with you, and I think it's probably the true mark of a real historian. I'm not a real historian. I'm learning. I'm a student of Devon, but like is the messiness of it all and acknowledging that like two things can be true. Like on one hand, like you said, the Industrial Revolution was a very good thing for a lot of stuff, but it was also a very bad thing. And just because those two traits exist at the same time does not negate the existence of the industrial. Does that make sense? Like there's a lot of complexity, a lot of shades of gray in history, and we need to take into account as many details as we can and be intellectually honest and not just throw ideas out, not just throw concepts out as bad or good. Yeah. Everything is very complicated.
It's the same deal for people who want to return either back to the agricultural era or even all the way back to like the pre-agricultural era of like hunters and gatherers. Yeah. Because there definitely would be some pros to going back to a farming community. Like community would just instantly skyrocket. People would be, I think everyone's mental health would instantly go up like a few points just because they wouldn't be on computers, they wouldn't be in factories, everyone would just rely on one another, and that would be a major plus. Of course, there are also many issues before that, like there were feudal lords and there was lots of starvation because people didn't have the same control over the food supply.
Exactly.
Disease were also much more deadly in that era too, just because the modern medicine didn't exist.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Like things never happen in a vacuum. That's all I'm saying.
And of course, the industry eventually led to the decline of religion, and before that, there were plenty of religious wars, like many more. I mean, if you think about it, religious wars basically died off in the West after industrialization took hold, because all the big wars since then have been mostly about either ideology or nationalism.
Yeah.
Back before that, like you got the Crusades, you got the 30 Years' War, you got many different battles between, especially like Christians and Muslims, and I guess in the East there were like more battles between like Muslims and Hindus.
You're right, and then on that note, like we've talked about I think in maybe the first episode of unipolarity and multipolarity, like you get this massive wealth that capitalism and these world economic systems create, and that thus leads to massive wars. And just like people are fighting over different things, like you said, now than they were fighting over back in a little, I guess, more simple times before all of this. Yeah,
and it's also one of the cons of having an interconnected world, because like if the world's very not interconnected, well, it's difficult to wage wars against people across the world because you can't even get to them in the first place,
and you have no reason to. Right? Yeah. Okay.
And of course, going all the way back to the pre-agricultural era would also have some pros, because for one, it would definitely benefit the environment. I mean, there wouldn't be mass amounts of pollution just killing off all these species. There wouldn't be entire habitats being leveled to like make room for factories or apartment blocks or any of that.
You'd be permanently camping. Yeah,
basically.
Doesn't sound too bad.
In a way, I think maybe mental health would probably be the best out of anything,
right?
Because that is in effect the lifestyle that people are actually adapted to be in.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Any more takeaways?
Yeah, and the story of industry is really one that's still ongoing because we're living through it even today. There's actually a fourth industrial revolution, like the AI revolution that you mentioned earlier.
Got you. Wow. So that's considered the fourth industrial. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And that just kind of gets applied to the rest of history too, because history is a story that never ends. There will always be more chapters and more stories to be written.
Just like this podcast.
Exactly.
There are always going to be more episodes that you guys are going to have to check out. But thanks, Devin. That was very insightful. If you guys haven't checked out episodes 1 through 5 yet, go ahead. You can check it out on Apple Podcasts. You can check it out on Podbean, Amazon, and YouTube. We are not yet up on Spotify. That's not going to happen in the foreseeable future, but it's okay because there are other platforms. Anyways, any last words, Devin?
Well, I'll see you next time on the next episode for Why Did America Win the Cold War? I'll see you then.
He's dropping the hints. All right, thanks, Devin. Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening in. You can follow us at World History Addicts Podcast on Instagram and subscribe for new releases and episodes. Take care, and I hope you can join us again.